not any special one. Uh, there was a little girl that I was seeing quite often over there.
To the world, Elvis Presley was untouchable, a man who seemed to control everything. The moment he walked into a room, a voice that could stop time, and a presence that made millions believe they were witnessing something greater than just music, something that could never be owned or controlled by anyone. But the truth is, Elvis Presley was never as free as he looked, and behind the fame, behind the screaming crowds, there was a life shaped not by the public, but people who did not just watch his rise, but quietly influenced every decision, every direction, and every moment that followed. They were not strangers and they were not distant figures in the background. They were the ones he trusted, the ones he depended on, the ones who had access to him when the lights went out and the world disappeared. And over time, their presence became something more than support. It became control. Subtle at first, almost invisible, but impossible to escape once it took hold. Some of them helped build the legend. Some stayed when everything began to shift, and some became part of a slow change that no one on the outside could truly see, a change that did not happen all at once, but unfolded quietly until the man behind the image was no longer the same. Because when you look past the spotlight, what remains is not just a story about success or fame. It is a story about dependence, about influence, about a man who gave everything to the world but never fully held on to himself. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that Elvis Presley was shaped, not just by his talent, but by the people he allowed into his life, the ones who stayed, the ones who made decisions, and the ones he could never truly escape. There were 5 people who defined Elvis Presley more than anyone else, and once they became part of his world, nothing ever stayed the same again. Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a small home that held more struggle than promise, raised in a close and deeply emotional family, where his bond with his mother would become one of the strongest influences in his entire life, shaping the way he loved, the way he trusted, and the way he held on to people long after he should have let them go. When his family moved to Memphis, Tennessee, something began to change, not all at once, but slowly, as he absorbed the sounds around him. Gospel from the churches, blues from Beale Street, country from the radio, and without fully realizing it, he started to create something new, something that did not belong to any one world, but somehow connected them all. By the mid-1950s, that sound had a face, and that face was Elvis Presley, a young man who suddenly became more than just a singer. He became a cultural shift, a figure that challenged what people expected music performance and even identity to look like. And as his popularity grew, so did the thrust, image, the world built around him, the confidence, the movement, the voice that seemed effortless, as if everything he did came naturally and without resistance. But behind that image, there was always something else, something quieter, something less certain, because while the world saw control, Elvis often lived without it, surrounded by people who made decisions, guided his path, and shaped his life in ways that were not always visible from the outside. His inner circle grew as his fame expanded, but instead of bringing clarity, it brought distance, because the more people he allowed in, the harder it became to separate loyalty from influence, support from control, and over time, that line disappeared almost completely. The man the world believed was in charge of everything was in reality moving within a structure built by others, a structure that gave him success but slowly took something away in return, something far less visible but far more important. And that is where the real story begins. Number 5. Sam Phillips. At the very beginning, before the fame, before the pressure, and before the world had decided who Elvis Presley was supposed to be, there was one man who simply listened. Sam Phillips was the one who heard something in him that others had not fully understood, yet not just a voice, but a kind of energy that felt raw, strange, and impossible to place inside the usual boundaries of country, gospel, or blues. For a brief moment, that gave Elvis something he would never truly have again: freedom. In those early days at Sun Records, he was not yet a global star, not yet a product, not yet an image being managed from every direction. He was just a young man discovering what he sounded like when nobody had fully taken control. Phillips mattered because he opened that first door. He gave Elvis room to experiment, room to fail, and room to become something new. Those first recordings felt alive in a way that later success could never fully recreate because they came from uncertainty, not calculation. But the problem with freedom is that in the music business, it rarely lasts for long. As Elvis began to attract attention, the business side of the story started closing in. Sun Records was a small label with limited reach, and Phillips was under financial pressure. That is when the choice was made, the choice that looked smart, necessary, even inevitable from the outside. Elvis's contract was sold to RCA Victor. And that was the moment something deeper changed. The sale brought Elvis a larger stage, more money, and a path toward national fame, but it also marked the end of the period when his life still felt like it belonged to him. From then on, the sound would be polished, the image would be shaped, and the decisions would increasingly come from people who saw not just a young artist, but a powerful commercial force. Sam Phillips had been the first man to believe in Elvis, but he was also the first man to let him go, and whether Elvis understood it at the time or not, that was the beginning of a pattern that would follow him for the rest of his life. The people who helped build him would also become the people who slowly took control away from him. Number 4. Priscilla Presley. At one point, she was the closest person in his life. The one who saw him without the lights, without the noise, without the image the world had created around him. Priscilla Presley did not enter his world as an equal. She entered it as someone young, impressionable, and completely drawn into the gravity of who Elvis already was. And from the very beginning, that imbalance shaped everything that followed. To Elvis, she was not just a partner, she was someone he could mold into the kind of presence that fit the life he was building, someone who would not challenge the structure around him, but quietly exist within it. He guided how she looked, how she dressed, how she carried herself, and even how she behaved in private, not with open force, but with a quiet control that became normal over time. It was not something the public could see, because from the outside their relationship looked like stability, like the king of rock and roll had finally found something real to hold on to. And for a while it worked, or at least it appeared to, because Priscilla adapted, learning how to live inside a world where everything revolved around one man and the expectations that came with him. But Elvis was never truly built for ordinary life, and the closer she got to him, the clearer that became. As his career continued, and the pressures around him grew heavier, the distance between them started to form slowly at first, then, in ways that could no longer be ignored. He spent more time away, more time surrounded by the same inner circle that never challenged him, never forced him to confront what was changing inside himself. The connection that once felt strong began to fade into something quieter, something more distant, until the relationship itself became another part of the life he could not fully control. When their marriage ended, it did not explode in public chaos, but it left something behind that mattered more than noise. Priscilla had been one of the few people who brought a sense of reality into his life. And when she was gone, that sense of balance disappeared with her. What remained was a world that felt more controlled than ever, but also far more empty, because losing her was not just the end of a relationship, it was the loss of one of the last connections he had to something genuine. And after that, the people around him did not bring him back to reality. They only pulled him further away from it. Number 3. Joe Esposito. There was a point in his life when Elvis no longer needed people who would tell him the truth. He needed people who would stay, and Joe Esposito was one of the men who never left. He was not a manager or a public figure, but he was always there inside the private world that Elvis built around himself, part of the Memphis Mafia, a circle of loyal friends who traveled with him, worked with him, and lived within the same, controlled environment day after day. At first, that loyalty looked like protection. Like Elvis had finally surrounded himself with people he could trust, people who would shield him from pressure and expectations. But over time, that protection became something else, something quieter and far more dangerous, because no one inside that circle ever truly challenged him or forced him to confront what was changing. They did not push back when his habits shifted, they did not question the direction his life was taking, and they did not break the patterns that were slowly forming around him. Instead, they adapted, supported, and stayed. And Joe Esposito, as one of the closest to him, became part of that system, whether he intended to or not. The more Elvis depended on the people around him, the less he stepped outside of that world, and what once looked like loyalty slowly turned into isolation. Because when everyone agrees with you, even when they should not, you stop hearing anything real at all. Joe did not create that environment, but he helped sustain it. And over time, that was enough to keep Elvis locked inside. A life that no longer had balance, no longer had resistance, and no longer had a way out, because he was not just surrounded by people he trusted anymore. He was surrounded by people who would never stop him. Number 2, Colonel Tom Parker. There was one man who stood above everyone else, not because he was closer emotionally, but because he held something far more powerful than trust. He held control. And Colonel Tom Parker understood Elvis Presley not just as a person, but as something that could be shaped, managed, and directed on a scale no one else could imagine. From the moment he took over Elvis's career, everything began to move with precision. The deals, the appearances, the films, the image, all of it, carefully guided by Parker's decisions. And at first it worked because he turned Elvis into a global phenomenon, a name that reached far beyond music, far beyond the stage, into something larger than entertainment itself. But control, when it grows too strong, stops being guidance and starts becoming limitation. And that is exactly what happened, because the same man who built Elvis's empire also began to define its boundaries, refusing international tours, pushing him into a cycle of commercial films and making decisions that served the machine around Elvis more than the man himself. Elvis trusted him, or at least relied on him, because Parker had positioned himself as the one person who could handle everything: the business, the pressure, the world outside. But that reliance came at a cost that became clearer over time. The more Parker controlled, the less Elvis decided, and slowly, almost without realizing it, he became trapped inside a version of success that he did not fully choose, repeating the same patterns, the same performances, the same expectations, while something deeper inside him began to shift. It was not a sudden collapse, it was a quiet confinement, a life that looked powerful from the outside but felt restricted from within, because when every major decision is made for you, even success can start to feel like a cage. Colonel Tom Parker did not just guide Elvis Presley. He defined the limits of his world, and once those limits were set, breaking out of them was never going to be simple, because by then, control was no longer something Elvis could take back. It was something that had already been taken from him. Number 1. Gladys Presley. Before the fame, before the pressure, before anyone else had a voice in his life, there was only one person who truly defined how Elvis felt about the world, and that was Gladys Presley. She was not part of the business, not part of the machine that would later surround him, but her influence reached deeper than anyone else ever could, because she was the center of his emotional world from the very beginning. The person he trusted, without question, the one he turned to for comfort, for reassurance, and for a sense of belonging that nothing else could replace. Their bond was not casual. It was intense, almost inseparable, and even as his fame began to grow, that connection did not fade. It only became more important because the larger his world became, the more he held on to, the one place that still felt real. But that kind of dependence comes with a cost, especially when it is taken away. When Gladys died, something inside Elvis did not just change, it broke in a way that could not be repaired, and those closest to him saw it immediately. The shift in his behavior, the weight he carried, the way he seemed to lose a part of himself that had once kept him grounded. It was not just grief, it was disorientation, because the one person who had always been constant in his life was suddenly gone, and nothing around him could fill that space. From that moment on, the people who surrounded him were no longer balancing him, they were replacing something they could never truly replace, and that is where everything began to unravel, not in a single moment but slowly over time, as the absence of that connection left him more vulnerable to the control, the isolation, and the decisions that followed. Gladys Presley did not shape Elvis through power or influence in the way others did. She shaped him through something far more permanent. And when she was gone, the foundation she had built disappeared, with her leaving behind a man who had everything the world could offer, but no longer had the one thing that had ever made him feel whole. In the end, Elvis Presley was never just shaped by fame, success, or the sound that made him unforgettable. He was shaped by the people who stood closest to him, the ones who entered his life at different moments, but left marks that never truly faded. Some of them gave him his first chance. Some built the world that made him a legend, and some stayed long enough to become part of the life he could no longer control. And when you look at it all together, the story begins to feel less like a rise to greatness and more like a path that slowly narrowed around him. He became everything the world expected him to be: the king of rock and roll, the symbol of a generation, the man whose voice and presence could never be replaced. But behind that image there was always something quieter, something harder to see: a life where control shifted from his hands into the hands of others. One decision at a time, one relation. The people around him were not villains. In a simple sense, they were part of a system, part of a world that grew larger than any one person could manage, but that did not make their influence any less real. Because in the end, Elvis Presley was not just a legend remembered for what he gave to the world, he was also a man shaped by what he could never escape, a man who trusted, who depended, and who piece by piece gave parts of his life away, without ever fully getting them back. And that is what makes his story stay with us. Not just the music, not just the fame, but the feeling that behind everything he became, there was always something he lost along the way. He gave the world everything, but he never truly got to keep himself.